Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. In this episode, we're talking about social protection and gig workers in Southeast Asia. Gig or platform workers, also called freelance or contract workers, offer their services on a task-by-task basis, all facilitated through digital platforms or apps. Rideshare drivers, food delivery couriers, freelance writers and graphic designers form the backbone of what we call the gig economy. And in Southeast Asia, the gig economy is booming. With its promise of flexibility, independence and low entry costs, gig work has attracted millions across the region seeking to earn a living in a rapidly changing economic landscape. But despite its popularity, gig work presents a host of challenges, especially when it comes to social protection. Unlike traditional employees, gig workers often lack access to essential benefits such as health insurance, retirement plans and unemployment benefits. They navigate precarious working conditions, leaving them vulnerable to financial shocks and unforeseen circumstances. In this episode, we'll look at how governments, unions and the platforms themselves are starting to think about bridging these gaps and extending protections to this growing group. This is the second episode in our special three-part series looking at emerging trends for social protection in the Indo-Pacific region. With me today I have three guests: Brendan Chia, Head Regional Public Affairs and Policy for GRAB, Francis Kim Opke, Director of Economic and Social Policy for the International Trade Union Confederation for the Asia Pacific, and Yeshim Elhan Kayela, Advisor, Office of the Chief Economist at the Asian Development Bank. Welcome, Brendan, Francis, and Yeshim.
Thanks, Jo. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the interesting discussion with this panel.
Yeshim, can I start with you? Can you give us an overview of the gig economy in Southeast Asia?
We all have been observing that digital platforms and online markets are growing at an increasing pace, and this is creating opportunities for workers and small entrepreneurs in Asia, particularly in terms of creating new jobs and opening up their market access. And Southeast Asia is at the forefront of this. And the gig economy is in fact booming in Southeast Asia. Just to contextualize some of the developments, according to our studies, Asia-Pacific region is poised to enjoy online market revenues of more than 4.3 trillion by 2025. And a significant portion of these revenues come from the e-commerce and online platforms. And the upward trend in the revenues generated are expected to continue, and the online food delivery platforms are at the forefront of this development as well. This is also opening up a pool of talent for the global economy, and the companies are actively outsourcing tasks to this vast pool of skilled freelancers, with 84% of hiring managers in the Asia-Pacific indicating that they would continue to do so. Overall, the online gig economy in Southeast Asia is a dynamic space with immense potential. And as the industry evolves, addressing workers' well-being and establishing clear regulatory frameworks will be crucial for its sustainable and continued growth.
Thank you, Yeshim. Francis, coming to you to talk about what all of this means for those workers that Yeshim was describing, and to think about gig work as decent work, or what kind of work gig work comprises. Does gig work blur the line between how we traditionally think about formal and informal kinds of work or kinds of employment?
Thank you for the question. As Yeshim addressed, we understand that the platform economy is one of the most significant changes by the digitalization of the world of work. And the platform economy has opened up the new market for businesses and created new jobs and income opportunities in Asia Pacific, in particular Southeast Asia, and often with the high flexibility and low barriers of access for workers. However, yes, a question is whether platforms have been providing quality jobs and decent work. According to the ILO, the decent work is very straightforward. It's productive and deliver a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for all. And it also provides better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize and participate in the decisions that affect their lives and working condition, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men. In this concept, I do not think that the platform economy has been providing decent work for us. In the recent report of dialogue on the platform work showed that workers in this platform economy are becoming more insecure in their work. In addition, as digitalization advances, even well-educated and skilled workers are facing uncertain working conditions, both in terms of the content of work and conditions under which they work, creating a sweatshop of the digital labor, especially in developing countries. Hence, my answer to this question is that the gig work doesn't blur the line between formal and informal work. Its gig work is an informal work. And in particular, in South Asia, gig workers cannot exercise, as mentioned, their rights as workers, in particular the freedom of association and the right to bargain collectively, and they are not covered by the social protection. Therefore, they are informal workers, and we should formalize them by recognizing them as workers with their rights and expanding social protection for them and including them in social dialogue.
Thank you. And hopefully in this interview, we can explore some of the ways that we can move towards the coverage of workers to extend some of those social protections and rights that you mentioned. Brendan, I'll come to you next. You work for Grab, which for listeners outside of this region, Grab is an app-based on-demand transport and delivery platform, similar to Uber, be more motorbikes, I would say, on the roads compared to cars in other markets. Can you describe the employment relationship that Grab workers have with the platform and how you think about this issue of the protections that can be provided, including social protection?
Thanks, Joe, and for sure. So our gig workers or the driver and delivery partners that work with Grab, they are flexible or non-standard workers. And from speaking with many of them, we know that they chose this line of work because they enjoy the flexibility that it offers. In many cases, they tell us that gig work complements another full-time job that they already have. So Grab's driver and delivery partners, they have the freedom to decide when to work, for how long to work, and also for which platform or even platforms to access work from. In terms of your second question on protections, I suppose as a platform, we think about this in two parts. The first is safety, right? And here the intent is to reduce the risk that incidents happen while the worker is at work. As a digital platform, we have been investing in ways to use technology to create a safer experience for users of our platforms. The second aspect of protection we think about is insurance protection, as well as access to broader social protection schemes. And I think we think about this quite deliberately, knowing that there is a gap between some of the schemes or the insurance protections that gig workers have access to. On insurance protection, throughout our markets in Southeast Asia, Grab provides complimentary work-related accident insurance for all our driver and delivery partners, and this covers death, disability, as well as reimbursement for medical expenses. Further to that, on access to broader social protection schemes, Grab believes that gig workers, like any other worker, should have access to social protection, and therefore we work very closely with governments to increase our driver and delivery partners' access to these national social protection schemes. So that's the two ways we think about it, right? Safety and then protections in terms of the broader insurance as well as social protection sense of the word.
Yesham, to Brendan's point about how we can at least ensure that gig workers do have access to some forms of protection like insurance, I know that the ADB has done some research into what kinds of protections gig workers would prioritise given the particular risks of their work.
In fact, we've done some research both in Indonesia and the Philippines with two different platforms. And the first study in Indonesia with Gojek platform was conducted in 2021, and the one in the Philippines with Grab delivery drivers was done in 2022. Interesting element that came out from both of them was that there was a great appreciation from the gig workers for the platforms, especially in supporting them throughout the pandemic and providing them an opportunity to even expand their business. 3 points came through for both countries. One of them was job security and continuity. Along with flexibility comes a sense of transience. And the workers have indicated that should there be a reason for them to stop working at any given point, would they be able to have the same job when they went back to the platform? and what that means for earnings when they're not able to work. The second point was about healthcare. It came through quite consistently, both in Indonesia and the Philippines, that not being healthy enough to work, again, was a big worry for them. Interesting finding in the Philippines survey was that the drivers trusted the platform, and they were willing to, in fact, co-pay if health insurance could be provided through the platform, rather than going to private providers. The trust in the platform actually went beyond those 2 points. Indonesia, for instance, was providing non-collateralized loan options for self-employed micro and small enterprises that couldn't otherwise access these resources outside, or in the form of healthcare, as I mentioned. The important element in both cases was intersectionality in terms of how we assess the feedback that we received from the merchants and the drivers vis-a-vis their circumstances. Gender, age, location, educational attainment, digital and financial literacy levels, and how long they've been on the platform. And we saw that there are lessons to be pulled from these surveys in terms of policies that are targeting not only employment generation, but employment generation for underserved groups, for instance, women entrepreneurs. One last point I'd like to make is the importance of how work is distributed through the platform as well. There is definitely a very strong flexibility element, but that flexibility is mostly in terms of when they work, as opposed to how they work. And this is a point that is very important for the gig workers in terms of both continuity of the work, as well as the importance of sustainability of their business going forward.
Brendan, coming to you, we've been talking a little bit about things like access to insurance and healthcare, but I was wondering if you had some other examples of how platforms like Grab might encourage or link gig workers to government-based social protection schemes, or at least some of these hybrid schemes.
Thanks, Jo. That's a really interesting question. And I think before diving into the specific roles that I think platforms like Grab could play, I think society first needs to get the policy level interventions right in the first instance. And what I mean by that is that there is that important assumption that government social protection schemes are available for everyone. That's not always the case. In fact, in many countries, social protection schemes have been designed around formal employment. We see that with the increasing trend of gig work, especially to what Yeshe mentioned, people are seeking to continue in gig work. That's part of the future of work. I think it's important that there are national social protection schemes that are first introduced and put in place that flexible or non-standard workers can also access. So I think that's maybe the first framing comments I had on the policy level interventions that would need to be in place. The second, then moving on to what digital platforms can do, I think platforms can play several roles, right? The first is they help to increase awareness of the social protection schemes that are available for flexible workers and provide information about these schemes. Because given the reach that platform companies have with a base of flexible workers, platforms can help increase these workers' awareness of these schemes and play a role to disseminate information about them. So we do this in the Philippines as well as in Thailand. In the Philippines, we have a partnership with 3 social protection agencies, namely the Social Security System or SSS, PhilHealth, which is a social insurance agency, as well as the Home Development Mutual Fund or PAMIBIG. So we host info sessions where these agencies can set up a booth at Grab's partner center in Marikina, Manila, and thereby help to increase awareness of these agencies as well as the services that they provide amongst our driver and delivery partner population. In Thailand, we have a similar partnership with the Thai Social Security Office to provide information to driver and delivery partners on how to register and how to contribute to the social security schemes that are available for self-employed workers. We do this actually through an online course on Grab Academy, our digital learning platform for drivers. So these are short, bite-sized online modules that provide information about the Social Security Office's schemes, as well as what's available for flexible workers. Another way the platform can play a role is to facilitate flexible workers' enrollment into these schemes. And at Grab, we do some of this, for example, setting up registration booths at our driver centers, or in other cases, helping to draw attention to the social protection agency's own initiatives. Maybe another example, a last one from Malaysia. we extended our partnership with Malaysia's Social Security Agency to facilitate driver partners enrollment and incentivize them with some limited temporary subsidies of the contributions so that they would be more incentivized to sign up and enroll in the Social Security scheme. So these are some of the ways, we see ourselves both as Grab and as the broader platform industry helping facilitate access to social protection schemes, as well as encouraging gig workers to enroll in them.
Francis, coming to you, we've just been talking about various kinds of really opt-in schemes. So either where Yeshin was talking about drivers potentially buying insurance through the platforms, or Brendan was talking there about how to get gig workers to enrol in national social protection schemes that are set up to reach informal or flexible workers. But we also know that these kinds of schemes where you're really relying on the workers to do the work, to sign up and to make those payments themselves, they're often undersubscribed. They often only reach a relatively small percentage of people doing informal work. What are the challenges for workers, and how do you think these schemes could work better for them?
Thank you, Joe, for an interesting question. According to the ILO, almost 60% of the platform worker has no health insurance, and more than 80% of the platform worker has no access to social protection program for employment injury, unemployment, disability insurance, or for old age pensions or retirement benefits. Asia-Pacific, in terms of social protection coverage, is behind the world average. And as a trade union, we are advocating the universal social protection, including social protection floors. And we emphasize the role of the government and platform. Brendan already explained the great role of the platform to disseminate information and encourage workers and assist and facilitate them to join some certain social protection scheme. But platform workers are often classified as self-employed in many countries. Hence, they face a reduced coverage compared to employees with high burden of payment for any social protection scheme. And even when they are classified as employees, the task-based payment model gives challenge to them for adequate level of social protection. The best way is to recognize them as employee with employment relationship and to expand social protection program for platform workers. Even in some countries with a self-employed status, they are recognized as a dependent self-employment so that the platform company have certain responsibility for protecting the workers. In South Korea, mandatory coverage for unemployment and maternity insurance were expanded to delivery workers and designated drivers working on the platform in 2022, and employment injury insurance was extended in 2023. That's why I emphasize the strong will of the government and the platform company to protect their workers is really important and essential.
Thank you. And that's a really nice introduction or segue into the next set of questions that I wanted to ask a bit about the role of the government's regulation. And as you say, how that relationship between the worker and the platform is defined and what that enables within the system more broadly. So, Yeshin, what role can governments play in legislating to define the relationships between gig workers and companies, or looking to extend schemes to workers? Anything to kind of bridge this gap that we're describing between workers and the protections that they need?
Allow me to pick up on that excellent point Francis made at the end of his intervention just now about the strong will of government and platform together for sustainable action going forward. If I may add to it, we have to also have a tripartite commitment in this one. So it's not only the government clarifying and creating a framework for certain targets to be met, including worker protection, for instance, or social protection measures. The commitment of platforms, as Brandon also mentioned, to raise awareness, make it a much simpler process to register perhaps, and provide a service or access to certain services. But also the uptake of the workers is very important. As you mentioned earlier, Joe, sometimes uptake can be quite low. There may be systems in place, but uptake can be quite low. And there are several reasons for that. One could be lack of awareness. Another could be whether they see it as a fit-for-purpose action or not for their reality as workers. And I do hesitate to generalize in this one, but perhaps going forward, there are certain elements that could be considered in crafting social protection schemes as the gig and the platform workforce continue to grow. Francis earlier has mentioned that defining the worker's status, identifying what it should include or not is an important element. But we also have the example of Singapore, for instance. The Singapore government adopted a social protection first approach. While all the discussions about the definition of what a worker is or a gig worker is, whether they trigger certain labor laws or not in their current definition, while that work is ongoing, they essentially took the step to say, we need to cover everyone. Leave no one behind. Flexible contribution models have been discussed quite often. Traditionally, social security systems are tagged to specific payment schemes and continuous salaries, for instance, income streams. But the traditional monthly social security contributions tagged to salaries do not necessarily work for the gig workers, which have fluctuations in their incomes or even their employment status. And the governments may wish to explore alternative models where income-based or individual contributions or a yearly contribution at installments options may be considered, as opposed to tagging it to a salaried structure. Portability of benefits. That comes up quite often, of course. As gig workers move between platforms, it would be important for them to have social security benefits that move with them, because otherwise it undermines the willingness to contribute to these systems or co-pay into these systems. If they can accumulate it across different platforms and different employers, it gives them a sustainable lifetime view as opposed to individual gigs and what they may or may not provide for them in the long term. And of course, on the legal and regulatory side, the data privacy and security, contracting and taxation, and copyright and intellectual property laws will have to keep pace with the changing nature of work and the needs of the workers on the platforms.
Brendan, you talked before about the need to get the policy right or the policy settings right. And here we've been talking about what happens when different countries legislate in different ways. What does this look like from Grab's perspective? How does that legislation and regulation change the way platforms have to operate in different places?
Thanks for the question, Jo. So I suppose I agree very much with what my fellow speakers are saying. There's a role for legislation to play to ensure that there are minimum industry standards around things like safety, for instance, or mandating insurance provision. I would really love to build on Yeshim's comment about the need for tripartite or multi-party commitment to this cause. I think that's super important, whether that's government, industry, workers, unions, multilateral development institutions, academia, to chart out the best way forward on this. Because if we think from a social protection first angle, how do we then move ahead to provide social protection to gig workers in a way that moves the conversation forward and actually provides the social protection to gig workers? Legislation is one important thing to focus on. But, to think a bit beyond this, we also need to address some of the most important root causes as well as drivers of the actual challenge, which is to extend social protection to all workers, of which legislation is one tool, I suppose, in the suite of tools available to us. So perhaps some of the drivers that go a bit beyond legislation could include how do we think about addressing the low enrollment types of issues that we were speaking about earlier, where people are not aware or maybe do not appreciate why social protection is needed. And we can sometimes see that there's a lot of unhappiness when social protection deductions or contributions into certain savings schemes are deducted, right? In some instances, it's because they are already covered from their other jobs. We feel it's a duplicate contribution. There are other instances where people may prefer to choose private schemes rather than national schemes, maybe because they provide better returns. And I would pick on Francis' point earlier to say that that's why things like what the government is doing in Singapore to give subsidies to the contribution amounts, I think those are some really important types of interventions that can help us address what's at the root that's driving this behavior, right, of people not being enrolled into social protection schemes.
Francis, how are trade unions and worker organisations advocating for the rights and social protection of gig and platform workers in Southeast Asia?
Thank you. In relation to that tripartite commitment, I would like to highlight the issue of the representation. That is to say, the freedom of association to bargain collectively and social dialogue. I mean, they need to have the freedom of association. They need to form and join the trade union. But in some countries, by legislation, because they are recognized as a self-employed, they cannot form their union. Of course, they can form associations. So, for example, Cambodia, this tuk-tuk drivers association, actually they are affiliated to one of our affiliates. So they are covered and they are under the trade union umbrella. So due to the nature of this platform worker, isolated and geographically dispersed workforce in different locations as online dimension, they are quite difficult to join, of course, and form their unions to represent their interests and bargain collectively for their working condition, including social protection contribution. I totally agree with you, Yeshim. We need to calibrate our policy in terms of contribution to fit to the platform workers. In Singapore, the platform workers are not recognized as employee, but there was an advisory committee on platform workers in 2021 to discuss how to strengthen the protection for platform workers. The committee gave 12 recommendations to government, I think the last year, and then the government accepted these 12 recommendations, and they are going to represent themselves. So they can bargain with platform companies like trade union, even though they are recognized as self-employed. So this is quite important for us as a trade union to make them to represent themselves as workers.
Thank you. That's a really nice point to make sure that we've raised about representation and association there. I want to end with a question for all of you to consider. This episode is part of a series we're producing on emerging trends and issues for social protection in the Indo-Pacific region. We're talking about where new frontiers are emerging for social protection practice. The rise of platform and gig work, as we've just discussed, really changing the nature of work, which is arguably disrupting this idea that we might have had that we were working towards progressive formalisation of work, which would lead to expanded social protection coverage, amongst other things. Not that we've abandoned that goal, but it is certainly being challenged by the way work is operating. So my question for you all is, what does the changing nature of work mean for social protection systems more broadly? If we're thinking about the intersection of government, platforms, employers, workers, how should those systems be changing to respond to that changing nature of work? Francis, can I come to you first for your answer on that one?
I would like to highlight this ILO Century Declaration for the Future of Work, adopted in 2019, asked all the ILO member states to put in place policies and measures that ensure appropriate privacy and personal data protection and response to challenges and opportunities in the world of work relating to the digital transformation of work, including platform work. And the decent work in digital economy will be the next year International Labour Conference. So now the government, they should respond to the questionnaire after consulting our employers and workers organization by August this year. So again, I would like to emphasize the workers' rights. Their workers' rights as a platform worker, they are workers. So social protection and social dialogue based on the freedom of association and rights to bargain collectively. These rights are essential for making platform work decent work, including social protection.
Thank you. Yes, the need to keep maybe traditional structures like trade unions very much in the picture as we look towards the future of work and thinking about how those might also adapt. Brendan, can I come to you?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So for me, I see the changing nature of work as really a broader mega trend, right? I suppose work is going to be increasingly fragmented, decentralized, disrupted, and really the platform work model is just one of many possible new work models that can emerge. So maybe two thoughts in response. The first would be governments and government policies will need to adapt to these new paradigms, right? How do we think about extending social protection to all workers, even as the very essential nature of work keeps changing? I think we raised the issue earlier about the case where the worker could be globalized, but social protection schemes tend to be jurisdiction specific, right? What new boxes can we think in to think about how this is increasingly a global challenge that we all have to address? So that's my first thought. The second thought would be, how do we also bring in the private sector as a solution provider to some of these challenges? There are, for example, private sector-led social protection programs. There are sandboxes and experiments that we can run. There are very novel ideas such as universal basic income, how can we quickly start to iterate and test how, we can expand social protection to all. So I suppose what's in my mind now is the future of work is this big mega trend. We need to think in new boxes to solve increasingly complex challenges. And I suppose, how do we go about that?
Thank you. Yeshim, and finally, your thoughts on this question.
The social protection framework will need to continue to evolve in tandem with the changing nature of work. And we have to bear in mind that what we call a gig worker is a very heterogeneous group. We have underserved members of different ages, gender groups, different educational attainment, and different locations. So the policies as we move forward will have to take all of that into account. We have talked about portable benefits, broadening contribution basis, new benefits models, and upskilling and reskilling programs. What we will need to see is intentional collaboration between the three stakeholders: government, businesses, platforms, as well as the workers' groups, and of course the social safety net providers. And the goal is to ensure that everyone, regardless of their employment model, has access to a basic level of security and can participate productively in the evolving world of work. So we leave no one behind, and we continue to support sustainable growth going forward.
Thank you, Francis, Brendan, and Yeshim, for this really fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed this discussion, so insightful.
Thank you for the great discussion, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for having me for this excellent discussion.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask our guests to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Cyrus Afshar, who is Social Protection Officer at WeGo and host of WeGo's Informal Economy podcast. Welcome, Cyrus.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So I actually reached out to you this month because it was your podcast that was sparking my interest. In the course of researching the interview we've just heard, I found an episode of your show about financing social protection for gig workers in Rajasthan in India. It's a really great interview with Nikhil Day, who's an Indian social activist. He's talking about efforts to establish a platform-based gig workers welfare board in the state of Rajasthan. This is quite a unique mechanism to India, a way for informal workers to register their work and have employers, or in this case, the aggregator platforms, make contributions towards social security and insurance. Why did you decide to feature this example on your show?
There were several aspects that made us choose this case to feature. So first, it was an experiment in the global south. Gig work or platform work is a phenomenon present in both developing country and developed economies. But although rich countries are starting to grapple with informality now, it has been the norm in the global south, where there are initiatives to support these workers that also deserve to be discussed. A second aspect is that the Rajasthan's policy is linked to the so-called welfare boards, which is a much older institution in India that protects informal workers. And it is through these boards that contributions are levied and benefits are granted, which brings us to the third aspect, which is the potential to use the learnings of this policy design to finance schemes for other occupational groups of informal workers that are left out of the conversation, but that are currently excluded from social protection. And finally, we chose the Rajasthan experiment because it is a genuinely interesting case. They managed to overcome the very contested issue of employment relation and bypassed it in a very smart way to get it done. So all platforms must contribute to social security, regardless of that matter, proportionally to the earnings that the worker generates. This episode was part of the new season of our podcast and briefing notes. So our podcast has just completed 5 years. And this year we started a systems mapping approach, which we were inspired by Valentina Barca's and Jaramillo Mejia's paper suggesting to see social protection as a solar system. The Rajasthan case was the second episode of the finance block. Currently, we are going through the registration block. Then we will move to the block of governance and then on to other blocks of this system delivery to talk about legal frameworks, etc. And by the end of 2 years, we expect to achieve a complete solar system that could be integrated into multimedia, visually appealing web page where you can, click, interact, and where we could see the whole of this repository.
Thank you. And can I say congratulations on 5 years of your show? I was saying to our team earlier, we've actually just come up to 3 years on ours. And that sounds like it's shaping up to be a fantastic resource on the building blocks of social protection. Alongside the podcast, each block also comes with a briefing note. We can link to that note on financing, which is about strategies to increase financing for social protection to enable the extension of coverage to workers in informal employment. Your next pick touches on the controversial idea that social protection may actually contribute to informality, which is, of course, not something we'd really like to see. What's the debate here?
So there is an argument we hear, especially in Latin America, that social protection policies actually contribute to informality. They argue that people who receive social protection payments may be encouraged not to seek formal work. And in February, we worked with socialprotection.org to present a webinar titled, Is Social Protection to Blame for Informality?, which aimed to challenge this view. We brought together specialists to critically review arguments in the literature, and they pointed out there were a series of flaws in the dominant interpretation, which puts in question the argument that blames the creation of social protection schemes for the existence of informality. But the reason I think it is important to challenge this idea is because these are very influential in shaping policy. These ideas effectively hinder efforts to expand social protection for vulnerable workers based on wrong conclusion. When the arguments are adequately tested, research concludes that the creation of social protection schemes for informal workers do not cause the decrease of labor supply in the formal sector, nor leads to migration of labor from formality to informality, nor increases the wage in the formal sector as argued. It was a really interesting webinar to watch.
Yes, thank you. In the interview we heard in the earlier part of this episode, we talked about that pathway or the traditional pathway of sort of moving from informality into formality, and that's the trajectory we want to see, and we want to see those protections coming in as people move into formal work. But of course, the changing nature of work, and particularly gig work and those sorts of ways of working, are really challenging that trajectory. So very important to be thinking about the social protection around workers. And as you say, if there are some ideas that social protection is actually going to kind of inhibit that pathway, when in fact, more and more we probably need to be thinking about how social protection is changing around those kinds of work. So thank you. I think that was a really provocative and very interesting webinar. We'll put the link to that one along with WeGo's recent literature review of that evidence on this topic in our show notes. It's been great to have you here, Cyrus. And to listeners, if you aren't already listening to WeGo's podcast, do check it out. It's a great resource. And one of the things I really value about it is the diversity of your guests, especially when you're able to bring in the voices of workers, organisers and advocates. What's the best way to find your show, Cyrus?
Well, Joe, just search for WeGo or Informal Economy Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Our show is on Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, but also at WeGo's website and at SoundCloud. You can always follow WeGo Global on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, where you can get all updates from WeGo, including our podcasts and our more recent publication.
That's fantastic. And thank you again for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast. And a special thanks this month to our friends at Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for inspiring this series and shaping these episodes. Don't forget to join us for the final episode in this series on emerging trends in the Indo-Pacific, when we'll be rethinking social protection to respond to the challenges of climate change. We are a production of socialprotection.org. Follow us on Twitter at SP_Gateway and find us on Facebook, YouTube and LinkedIn. Subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love it when you leave a review. Back next month. See you then.